Thank you for having me this afternoon. Let me just say that I've got a lot of aircraft to talk about, and since this talk is about the airplanes themselves, I'm not going to be able to tell a lot of the interesting stories that almost every one of the aircraft have. And I'm sure a lot of you have the stories because I've already talked with several of you, and y'all have stories about some of the aircraft that you will see here. But since we're going to concentrate on the aircraft, we're going to move through them pretty quick. Usually when I talk to people about the aircraft owned by R.G. LeTourneau, almost invariably, especially in this area, it's the A-26 or B-26 is converted. But the LeTourneaus had at least 14 aircraft before he bought the very first A-26. His very first one, well, this is Mr. R.G. when he was about 13 years old. I usually start these out with a little more history about the family, but in the factory, this was the factory across the plant. Myself, I work at the factory, which today is Joy Global. We've changed names and owners several times, and a lot of you may have read in the news that now we have been purchased by Komatsu. So whether in the next year or so the name changes to Komatsu, we don't know. I did a talk here just a few weeks ago about the domes. As you see the domes here, we have 5 on the property. Dome 1 right here was actually built for Reverend Billy Graham. It was never intended to be right there because they were going to build it, put it together, and ship it off to Billy Graham, and it turned out he could not use it for legal reasons, so it was just never taken down. And evidently Mr. R.G. liked him because he built 4 more. And number 1, and this is 2, they're aluminum, they're bolted together. That's actually a portable building that you see sitting there. And of course we can't go into that story, but then number 3 and then 4 and 5 are made out of steel that are welded together. 4 and 5 were built in the late 60s specifically to build bombs in for Vietnam. That's the bomb line. If I tell, well, not the young guys, but if I tell the older guys, I'm going to the bomb line, they know I'm going down under the hill to those domes down there. Mr. R.G. bought his very first aircraft in 1939. It was a Waco EGC-8. Now, that picture right there, it was probably very new. This picture was taken in Toccoa, Georgia at the brand new airport that he built there. In fact, today, the airfield was several years ago, was given to the county, Stevens County. It is the Stevens County Airport, but it is still today the R.G. LeTourneau Field, the Stevens County Airport. But this was his Waco that he built. It was 1938, and he bought it in 39. Here's a little better picture of it. Somebody was asking me earlier how many would that seat, and you can see several of those guys aren't little guys. All 5 of them got in there, but you wouldn't want to go very far. The pilot on the left, R.L. LeTourneau, Mr. R.G., and then count it, and then Mr. Jensen, who was the photographer, whose daughter married one of R.G.'s sons. So now that is a better picture, but here's an even better picture of that very plane, 1939, and it's a 1938 Waco. I took this picture last year. The man that owns it, and let me tell you what, we came that close to that plane being here today. It's in South Carolina, and of course he's not going to fly it in bad weather. Everything has to be perfect for him to get it out and fly it in. And he had planned to do that all along, but as he told us, weather conditions will decide this. He is the chief pilot at a company, and he had a scheduling thing that almost knocked it out. But in the end, it was weather. He said, I'm not going to take it out. When he does travel in it, he does not ever leave it outside. If he flies in and lands somewhere, it will be in a hangar locked, or he's not staying there. I mean, he's told me that. And but it took him 18 years to restore this plane. I went out there, took pictures inside and out. It's perfect. The stories he has of some of the glass that's curved, how he had to make all that. It's the stories behind it, the restoration, but it is perfect. It's something.
Is there any chance of ever getting that back?
Well, I was just going to say, this plane's for sale. It is. My suggestion is there's enough people here to take up a collection. Purchase the plane and donate it to LeTourneau University. It needs to be back home. It needs to be here. But
for the record, you do not work for LeTourneau University.
I do not. But he is very, very, very particular who he would sell it to. I think he wants to move on to another restoration, but he doesn't have the money to have two. He's not a rich person, so he can't donate it himself. He needs the income from it. But he would prefer that it end up here at LeTourneau University permanently on display out at the airport. And that would be best case scenario for him. So just putting that out there.
What's the price?
Well,
$250,000.
yes, over $250,000. Neighborhood of $300,000. But I would say if he got some serious interest in it, I think he would be negotiable on that. But he seriously wants it here, but that's a whole nother story. Now, Mr. RG's, see, that was the first one. Now, his, wrong way. This was actually his third aircraft. He bought a small, second one was a Piper. At the Toccoa Airport, they had started the Toccoa Falls Flying School, so he bought a Piper for training. This was actually the third aircraft that they purchased. This is a Taylorcraft BC-65. It was purchased in December of '39. This is the only known picture that I know of this aircraft. It is in the hangar that they built there in Toccoa. But this one has a tragic end because this is the plane that Mr. Ben's brother actually crashed in a few months in August of 1940. He and another guy about his age were both 19. They were delivering parts out east, got into a storm. Not sure the details, but got into a storm, it broke it up, and they crashed and killed both of them in this plane right here.
He'd only been married about 2 weeks.
Oh.
That's right. In about 2 months' time, he had accepted Christ as his Savior. He went to Toccoa Falls Institute. He had accepted Christ as his Savior just before graduation from Toccoa Falls. On graduation day in the morning, they graduated. That afternoon, he got married. And a few weeks later, he was killed in an aircraft crash. That short window of time. RG's aircraft, as you can see, like Mr. RG's life, there were a lot of people don't associate tragedy with him. There's a lot of tragedies in their life, and this was one of them that was associated with the aircraft.
The hangar was all built out of steel.
Steel, just like the many steel houses like that. This one, the fourth and fifth plane were Pipered again at the Toccoa Falls Flying School. This was his first Lockheed. This was a Lockheed 12A Junior, Electra Junior. This one here, he purchased, well, I didn't write that down. It was along in '39. He purchased this aircraft, and here's the picture of it with RG, and the two ladies were probably part of the singing where he was going to speak. But the man on the right was the pilot. His name was Usher Rosh. Now, I'm putting a lot of these stories down and what made it end up being a book. But these stories just go out. Usher Rosh, this was 1939 or so. He had already had a flying career You got to think in the 30s now, in Hollywood, flying in movies. At one point, I talked with the man in Toccoa that knew him, and he said Mr. Rush walked with a limp. He was flying on plane in a movie that the scene was supposed to be that he came down low, and they had pyrotechnics supposed to go off, and it looked like the plane blew up. Something went wrong, and it did blow up the plane with him in it. So, I mean, his stories just go on and on and on, too. This was the same plane. The man on the left, this Mr. RG on the right, man on the left is RL, or Dick LeTourneau, who was very instrumental early in purchasing planes. I have papers from his files where the government wanted to take some of the planes back, and he's the one who went to Washington and back and forth with the government. And but RL was instrumental, and he was also a pilot. He piloted some of the planes back in the day. Here's Mr. RG on that Lockheed Electra. It's well known that he did some of his best thinking on an airplane. Sit there and draw. This one actually was confiscated by the government and sent to Canada. And this is that same plane in its Canadian numbers, 1531. Now, let's see, the sixth plane was another Piper Cub for the Toccoa Falls. This one was his second Waco. This one is a 1941 SRE. This picture was taken in Peoria. He had a factory in Peoria, and at the Peoria airport, they built a hangar. So we have several pictures that were taken at the Peoria airport. But this was the second Waco. I tried to track this one down, and the last we knew, it went back to California to a dealer, and we've lost it. I don't know where it is today. It may be scrapped. This is a very unique aircraft. This is a 1934 Northrop Delta. There were only 8 made like this. This was the last one, and of the 8, this one had a unique engine. So technically, this is a one-of-a-kind aircraft that Mr. RG purchased. He purchased it in 41, so he didn't buy it. Well, he did. This one was one of them that he bought new. And he didn't keep, some of the aircraft he didn't keep long, so this was one that he had, and he flew for a few years. And I said, I've traced a lot of these. I'm trying to track down where are they today. I'm on the trail of this one, but here was his second Lockheed. This was another 12A Electra Junior, built in 37, but he purchased it in 1942. There's a plane. This is another shot of that plane. This was out at Longview Airport when the tower was at the terminal building. That's the tower. Now they have since taken the tower part off, and the windows are enclosed, but that structure is still there today. But as you see, this family, they staged this shot. It was a family getting on there. They had started an air service. You could rent a plane, or you could go on trips. And here is a very rare picture to have color pictures of back in those days, but this is Bob Lyle, the pilot, with that Lockheed Electra. Very unusual to have color pictures back in these age here. Now, before I show you that one, before I show you the one I just showed you, Amelia Earhart. Who can tell me what kind of plane she had that she was finally lost her life in? It was a Lockheed, but hers was a 10. RG owned these 12s. As far as I have not been able to find records that he owned a 10. He owned several 12s. Amelia Earhart's plane was a 10. Her aircraft, of course, it was gone, and recently, I think it was 2009, they made a movie about Amelia Earhart. In that movie, they did a lot of computer graphic simulation, but they located this plane Today it resides, what's left of it is in Florida, but they rented this plane, did some modifications on it so the real airplane enthusiast that says, that's not a 10, that's a 12. Well, they modified some things to make it look exactly like Amelia Earhart's. This is a scene from the movie. Now, what they did, it was not in flying condition. This was at landing. They staged this. They put it out on the airport. They added the sparks and everything with computer graphics afterwards. But they staged several scenes with this plane. Now, this is one that RG actually owned and flew. But it was in the movie in 2009 in the Amelia Earhart. This is another scene from the movie where it's inside. I mean, today, this is how it looks. Down in Florida, an individual owns it, and he has all the parts and pieces. And he still has, I didn't have the picture, but he left the registration numbers from Amelia's plane, of course, were different from RG's, but he left the numbers on there that the movie people painted on it from the movie. So that probably makes it a little bit more valuable now, it was in the movie. But, okay. This was his 11th plane. This was the Lodestar, Lockheed Lodestar. Now, there's a lot of stories behind this one too, but this was a bigger one. This was an 18, Lockheed 18 Lodestar. One of the nieces wanted to get married in this plane, and out in Toccoa, and they agreed. But when the time came for the ceremony to take place, they wanted the 18 because it had more seats. So the minister and the bride and groom and the best man, and they wanted a couple other people, but the 18 was out, so they had to use one of the 12s. They still did it in the airplane, but it was a smaller one. Fewer people got to go. But this was the Lockheed Lodestar that he owned. There's the side shot of it. Mr. Elmer Isgren there to the right. Some of you may have flown on some of these planes, and we're getting up into, this would have been in 42, where we would be getting into some era when some of you may have seen some of these planes. And now here is the 12th plane, Beechcraft Bonanza, and later on they bought another one. I think the other one, a lot of the planes that they bought in this size were in pieces. And they brought them here and let the guys, the students, put them back together, and then made them fly in it. So, no, I don't know about that part. You put it together, you fly in it. So, I'm not sure about that. But this was his first Beechcraft Bonanza, purchased in 1947. And again, they staged the shot. They used it in the charter service. This was probably in an advertisement. You can rent a plane, go wherever you want. Now the 14th, again, this was here in Longview, because this was in 46. This was, again, it was going to be for students to fly, and they would probably take it all apart. Now, here we are to the A-26s, which everybody talks about. This is a really beautiful color shot that I found. At first, I thought this was probably the first and second, but it's actually the second and third ones. But there's a little closer shot. Had them all painted up the same. These have already been converted. They did the executive conversion where they put real nice cushions and seats. And the Bombay, I've had a lot of questions. What about the Bombay? You just open up and the whole floor goes away. Well, they removed all of that and put in solid floor, except on one side where the ladder would drop down. And so the Bombay areas here were enclosed. A lot of the sheet metal was removed and revamped for storage areas and to be in different locations. And the compartments on the inside. Here is the Roy with the very first A-26. And you can see on the plane there, they named this one Snippy. Mr. Ben, do you know why they named it Snippy? I have not been able to determine that.
I've ridden in that front nose.
I have heard some scary stories about that nose up there. In fact, I'll tell one. Mr. Billy Graham, Mr. RG was flying him somewhere, haven't been determined where, but Mr. Billy Graham was in the front, and they got close to where he was going to speak, so they landed in a cornfield with the corn stalk still up. Billy Graham said the corn was just going like that. Scared him to death, and he's finally got there, but it was called the fishbowl. You get in there and you sit there before it's moving, it's just hot. The sun's beaming in through there.
And you have to crawl through a tunnel to get up there.
That's another question. I hadn't been able to. How in the world do you get in there?
Crawl through a little tunnel.
And come
Maybe
underneath.
It opens up with the glass.
We don't know.
Maybe you have to go through that
Right.
little hole.
But this was Snippy. Now, some of you may see pictures later on, and you're actually seeing Snippy that has a metal nose, because they did remove the glass and they put a metal nose. In fact, these other shots, one of those is Snippy, and it was later on when they removed the glass. He only purchased one with the glass nose. This was Snippy. That's the only one. All the rest of them came with a full metal nose. But one of these is Snippy, and then the other one is no, I'm sorry. Snippy was the first one. That's wrong. But later on, they did remove the glass nose and put metal up on the front. Now, this was Snippy. This was the end of Snippy. As I've said, I've tried to trace the end of all of these aircraft, where they're located. Mr. Bob Flanagan, manager of the plant and the aviation department at the time, went out to take this plane up. They had repaired it out at the airport. Don't know what they were doing. They had done some maintenance and some repairs. He was the head of the department. He went out and took it up. And this is just past the end of the runway as here in Longview. What they suspect is a piece of sheet metal came off and went to the back and clipped some wiring and damaged it to the point where he lost complete control, and it went straight down. And he was in it by himself. Good friend of mine, Bryce Stratton, has told me that he was going with him that day. He and Bob had headed to the airport, and before he left the plant, secretary called him and said, Mr. Stratton, I got a question for you. He said, no, we're going to fly. I'm going. And she said, no, you got to answer this question. So he stopped and went over there, and he told Bob, said, Bob, just go on. I'll catch you another time. I've got to take care of this, whatever it is. And so Bob went out there by himself and took it up, and just past the end of the runway went down. This is number 2. This one is Pappy. And they named it after the head mechanic, Pappy Myers. But this was number 2, one of the planes you saw in the color aerial shots of them there. The Pappy went around the world. I wish I had time to go into the pilots. The pilots of some of these. Barney Barnwell flew this plane many thousands of miles. Here's a shot looking down into the cockpit a little bit closer. Here's the part of the executive conversion. The entrance, the bomb bay would have been here. They closed all that in to get into the planes. Starting about right here, this section let down and had a ladder on it. So everybody get in. Some of them would have to step at the top of the ladder, step over into these seats. They would raise it up, and then you could walk on that after it was in flight and closed. Here's Pappy in. This would have been an area that one of the settlements Mr. RG had in Liberia, or the settlement in Liberia had one in Peru. But Barney Barnwell flew this plane all over the world. Again, some amazing, unbelievable stories about these planes and what Barney did with them. This is number 3, the registration of N115RG. This is Longview Airport, the tower, the old tower there. But this was the third one. There it is out at the hangar. It still exists out at the airport today. The school doesn't have it, use it today, but there it is sitting among other planes. And this one had a crash, as you can see. This is in Portland. The nose wheel failed to open, to engage. They came in, and he could tell that his nose wheel, the other wheels had locked, the nose wheel wouldn't lock in place. And Chuck Hammett, the pilot, did everything he could, slamming it and all of the tricks. Nothing would make that wheel pop in. And he flew over, and people on the ground would look at it and make suggestions to him. Nothing would work. So he flew it around until he used up most of the fuel, and he had no choice but just to come in. And he said, as one of the stories, he said he slowed it down as slow as he could, which was about 90 miles an hour or something, you know. But he brought it in, and there were at least 4 other people on there with him. What he did, he had them all get as far back into the plane as they could to shift the weight to the back to keep the nose up as long as they could. And so they did, and they went in. You can see the propellers were bent, and they went in. The fire department, because he'd been flying around using the fuel up, so all of the fire trucks were there, everything was there. So they followed him to a stop and brought the foam out, no fire or anything. They called Longview, called Pappy Myers, told him what had happened. They got in to determine why it didn't lock down. Pappy got all the parts that were needed, new props, all the other parts needed. He and a crew got on another plane, flew out there. The next weekend, they flew that plane back to Longview. That's Pappy Myers. That's one reason they named the plane after him. He knew what he was doing. This is another one that's on the registry that RG owned. So you can see parts were scavenged. This is in Longview. This one probably never flew under LeTourneau registration. He may have just gotten it for parts. I want to mention another plane, A-26, that is in a museum, I think in Wyoming, that has the graphics on the side is Lulu. I've been told about Lulu, and that it was connected to LeTourneau. Some say that it was one of his that they owned, but in fact, he never owned it. He did do a conversion, an executive conversion on that aircraft about 1958. So Lulu is now restored to its military outfit, and it's in a museum in Wyoming. And its connection to LeTourneau was it had an executive conversion done on it. Here's another one that he did own. And I found this picture on the internet through tracing registration numbers, and we really know nothing about it. We don't know how long RG had it, and even where this picture was taken. So I've heard several, I've been told, excuse me, different people have different opinions of how many A-26s that LeTourneau had. I've heard as many as 23. But I can only document about 6. And then 2 others that were here that had the executive conversion on them. So, and some of the later ones were scavenged for parts to keep the others running. Some of them I've located. There's one in a museum in Brazil. That one was sold by LeTourneau. And it was actually in the late 60s, it was confiscated in a drug raid in Brazil, and long past LeTourneau connection. But it was confiscated in a drug raid, and they turned it over to the Brazilian Air Force. They used it for a while, and then they gave it to a museum. So the last definite location I have is like from 1985. So whether it's still there or not, I'm not sure. But He did have several of the A-26s, converted them, used them, some for parts. Here is another Lodestar that he had. Now this is Barney Barnwell on the left, and this man Shivers is governor of Texas, and Bob Flanagan. Bob Flanagan is the one that crashed in Skippy out at the airport. The documents that was with this photo indicate that this was the last photograph of Bob Flanagan. This was just a few weeks before he took that A-26 up and crashed out at the airport. But Barney and Bob had gone, picked up the governor, brought him in for a big trade show that LeTourneau was here to exhibit earth-moving equipment. They did that often back in those days. There's Barney and a co-pilot inside the Lockheed Lodestar. Here's an interesting one. This is a 1944 Curtiss C-46 Commando. Another military plane. LeTourneau purchased it in '53. And that's Barney sitting up there piloting it. Again, this is at the LeTourneau hangar out at the airport. Here's another picture. These were LeTourneau employees loading up, and they were going to fly to Peru. Mr. R.G. started a settlement in Peru in Ternavista. He built Ternavista. They were flying into Pucallpa, which was the closest airport that a plane this size could fly into. They later carried equipment and other things, but he was carrying people down at this time. This is one of the planes that's kind of blurry, but I just got this photograph from Floyd Bishop's son sent me. This is a much bigger picture. There's another plane over there. This is the only picture that we have of a Piper PA-18 Super Cub. But it's not the only picture. This is the only of it complete, because here's another picture we have of that plane that you just saw. They carried it to Ternavista inside of the Curtiss C-46. They took it apart and put it inside. There's also floats in there for a Cessna 195 that they actually did fly down there. They flew the Cessna down when they were going to put it on floats use it on the rivers. The floats are in here, and they flew the Cessna down as a land plane, and then we're going to put the floats on. But that is the Piper inside of the Curtiss Commando right there. Mr. Floyd Bishop and his family. This is a Piper PA-12 Super Cruiser. Now this is in Liberia, Africa, at Tornado, the settlement that RG built in Africa. Mr. Floyd was a pilot over there, several planes. They had a Cessna 195 there also. We'll see in just a minute. The sequence that these are in are as best that I could determine of when the year that they were purchased. So the sequences are when they were purchased by the company. Not necessarily built, because some of them were older planes. This is the Cessna 195. This is one of the contributory rivers in Ternavista in Peru. Those floats were inside of that Curtiss on the way down there. Here is Mr. Bishop with the Curtiss 195 in Liberia. They flew over there. Here's a very interesting aircraft. This is a Northrop YC-125A Raider tri-motor. I've heard a lot of stories. I've heard people say, yeah, they've had a big tri-motor way out in the weeds, and is this all grown up? Well, it's not out by the weeds. This was the hangar right here. It was sitting right there by the hangar. And what they did, they trained students. They would take the engines off, rebuild them, hang them, run it, do run up, test it out for years. It was eventually sold. Now, and they did, it stayed in flying condition because they would fly it at least once a month. One of the instructors would take it up, just fly it for a little small amount of time, come back in to the airport. So they kept it in flying condition. This is the last known photograph of that plane. This is in Tulsa, around 1988. They took this photograph just before a man had purchased it and he was going to fly it out. They went and did maintenance on it where they could fly it. They were flying it from Tulsa here to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to go into the Air Force Museum. That's where it was headed. They took off from Tulsa, and the propellers on this engine, the propellers have an electrically rotated to reverse. He had just lifted off the ground and a wire shorted out on one engine and rotated the propellers on one engine. So that sent him in a spin and down, and it hit the ground, went over an embankment across a road, and it slid around and hit a telephone pole and caught on fire. The pilots got out, everybody was fine, but the plane was damaged beyond repair, so it never made it to the museum. But it was on the way, but it was lost. Here, this is another. There were 4 of these. This is a Beechcraft C-18S. Now we have some pictures. 4 of these were donated to LeTourneau by the government for training purposes. Now I have the photos that I have found. I believe only 2 of them were in flying condition. The others were for parts. And eventually they scrapped the other 2, and the paperwork that I found, you couldn't just scrap an airplane, especially if the government had given it to you. You had to go through a mountain of paperwork just to scrap it, and it was just scrap aluminum laying on the ground. But it was a lot of trouble to scrap an airplane that the government had donated to you. So, but this is one of them that they had actually in flying condition. Again, this is inside the hangar out at the airport. A Beechcraft C-18S. Now this brings us up to 1965. This was the first Learjet. Mr. RG had more than one Learjet. But this was the first one that he purchased. This was Learjet 23. And he purchased it from the factory. In fact, he went out there and took delivery from Mr. Lear. We have several pictures where, of course, they got to tour the factory and everything. But this is Mr. RG and Mr. Lear discussing it out there by the plane. And you see the call letters up there, N216RG. Probably at RG's request, I'm sure. But that brings through about 1965. Well, in my research, I've gone a little past that, but I'm kind of stopping at the Learjets because Mr. RG passed away in '69. This was really some of the last ones that he had personal connection with. And my research is, I'm kind of keeping it to the ones that he had a personal connection with. The ones afterwards were training and different things, and he didn't have a personal connection to. Now, that's all the slides that I have. Now, do we have any questions? Anybody have questions that I might try to answer?
So the A-26s that were green and white, right? They were repainted to green and I think the black color. Was that just RG LeTourneau's colors, or was that the standard colors they painted all of them?
No, that was their choice. They could paint it. Well, you saw one was blue and white. One was blue and white. I think those others were brown and white. Yeah.
It was a dark tan and a light tan.
There you go. Dark tan, light tan. You saw them, didn't you?
Didn't get to ride it one time.
But no, they chose those colors. For what reason, I'm not sure. But
Who is they? I mean,
the aviation department. See, we're celebrating 60 years of the aviation training. Well, it goes, as you can see, it goes back a lot farther than that. He had his first plane in '39. So there was an aviation department of RG LeTourneau Incorporated before the aviation division as you know it today. that it kind of came out of the aviation department of R.G. LeTourneau. Bob Flanagan was head of that department, the one that went down in the A-26.
In '66, my summer job was to scrap out one of the A-26s.
Really? Right? You know the serial number off that. and let me just say, I have to be very careful with what I say because I don't want to have opinion. I've gotten what the information I have from actual documents. Our archives over here at the library are amazing. It's unbelievable the amount of information that's in there. We have documents there. I have gotten files from Mr. R.L. LeTourneau's family that have a treasure trove of actual documents in there. I've gotten documents from other places and able to track down some of these. And of course, in the aviation world, a lot of you know, everything has to be documented and a lot of that information is available. So I do searches for serial numbers. That's why registration numbers are very important. If I can find that registration number, it may have had 5 or 6 registration numbers over its life, but I can trace that aircraft to where it is today or if it has been scrapped or whatever. But what I will be putting in our writing will be documented information.
Well, he spoke all over the world. Every weekend he spoke something.
That's right.
So the planes were to get him from one place to
That's
the
right.
other as quickly as possible.
These weren't just for work. Now, he used them for work and he would fly as managers, because at the time he had a plant in California, Peoria, Toccoa, Georgia, Vicksburg, Mississippi, and in Longview, Texas. Well, even in Rydalmere, Australia, and for a short time he had a plant in England. And so he was flying managers himself to plants, but probably more than company business, he was flying to speaking engagement where he would go literally anywhere in the world and share Christ. And one writing, someone asked Mom, his wife, well, what do you think about Pop traveling? And she said, he's doing the Lord's work. And she said, he has been home one weekend in the past 2 years. One weekend in the past 2 years. And if it wasn't a weekend during the week, he's over here at the plant. Which way? That way. He's at the plant or at one of the plants. So he was very, very serious about sharing the gospel to anyone, anywhere. We have letters over here in the archives where people would write in requesting that he would come. Someone organized that, and they, many times they would have to reject him because he already had a schedule set up for a year, but he flew anywhere in the world. If he couldn't come to your place to speak, to tell the gospel, it was because he was already scheduled or there was some other conflict. It had nothing to do with who, what, when, or where you were. He would go if he could. And this was his transportation, all of these aircraft. They were in several accidents. I meant to mention, I lost it. Well, the very first one, he didn't wait long to get an experience in crashing an airplane. This the very first one he purchased, he and his pilot flew up into Canada, and he flew in at night. The pilot looked it over, and neither one had been there before. They saw the airstrip. Okay, here we go. Pitch black dark. 39, they didn't have advanced airports. This was more or less a field, but it was the airport. So they went in, and of course they found out later that this ground, they were actually working on the ground. They had plowed it that day. It was rough. And the article says he made a perfect 3-point landing upside down. So he didn't wait long for the experience of crashing in an airplane. And he and Mom went down in an A-26 in a field at some point. So, it wasn't all just wonderful, pleasant flying. He had some experiences that those stories are out there.
They landed in Illinois and went off in the river.
Oh, really? At Peoria, Illinois, they had a factory there, And they used the Peoria Airport, which was already established quite a bit, but he wanted to be closer. So the Peoria factory was right on the Illinois River, and they filled in a lot of it in a low area. They filled it in long enough for a landing strip, and he would land the Lodestar there. I've talked with some from up there, a man that was actually there the day that he landed there, and he said we were all scared to death because they thought it was going to go off the end. But he landed it right there. He built his own strip, of course, in Toccoa, Georgia. He built his own landing strip in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg plant is about 15 to 20 miles out of town, so he had a lot of pasture land. But it's lowland, and it's right on the Mississippi River. So he built his first strip behind the plant, but it wasn't long till that flooded. So they had to go across the road where the hills and hollows started over there. And they knocked the top of the hills off, filled the valley up, and made a long strip there. I'm very familiar with that because that's my hometown. I've deer hunted on that property where that strip is, and where he knocked the tops off and filled it up, on each side it made a pond. And I've done frog gigging and fishing in those ponds when I was little and growing up, and I lived at LeTourneau, Mississippi, over there back in the day. Any more questions?
Do you remember the last one before the layer? Did you ever get any pictures of that? It was in a solid color at the last.
An A-26?
Yeah. And he always wanted to go faster. And
That sounds like him.
we filled it all in. It had all flush rivets, filled in everything on the surface. We got the privilege of sanding on it until it got just as slick as it could be, and then they painted it a solid color. And it went a little faster than it did before.
Really? Do you have pictures of that?
I don't, and I don't know if anybody here does.
I don't know if I have. Where'd it go? There it is. I don't know that I have pictures of that. I am constantly discovering new pictures, though. Some from people that send them to me that, like yourself, maybe have experienced them, and some digging in the archives, and I have not gotten to the bottom of all the boxes in the archives, so there's still more information to be discovered about these. Anybody else?
In 1966, they had an air show at the airport, and it wasn't the best one we ever had. But Pop came back in the Lear. I don't know whether he'd been to Milwaukee or someplace speaking. And what the air show didn't provide, they provided. Yeah. He went straight up from the middle of the field.
That RG was in there, and he was probably loving it.
Loving it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was staged because they came in about 20 feet off the runway, and when they got the middle of the crowd, pulled right up, and I mean, until the plane disappeared, and then of course 5-10 minutes later, coming around the final on land, and taxis in, well, a crowd just crowded around the airplane, and he comes out of the airplane shaking and laughing.
Yeah.
He was flying coming into Mississippi, and Mom wanted him to stop because she had a clock manufacturer in Jackson, and she wanted to buy one of their clocks. And I looked over to Mom and I said, "How much does one of those clocks cost?" And she told me, and I said, "Well, how many different ones do they make?" And she said, "Well, they make 3 different kinds," and she got to make up her mind which one she wanted. So I told Mom, I said, "Well, now, wait a minute." I said, "Why don't you just order all 3 of them, and the 2 of them that you don't want, you can throw them away." Because it costs less than that to leer this,
Yeah.
set this leer down and pick it back up.
Yeah. Yeah.
We didn't stop.
You didn't stop, huh? Okay. It made sense. Any more questions?
Did RG ever pilot?
No. As far as I know. Mr. Ben? No. As far as I know, he never did. He was not interested in that. That's a good point. An aircraft, a car, train, whatever, it was transportation. It was transportation to get him where he needed to be to do what he needed to do. He didn't waste the time. As you saw some of the pictures, we have several of him on the plane working. That's where he said he did his best work in an airplane, just sitting there thinking, because the phone wasn't ringing, nobody was asking him questions, he was concentrating, and then and so as far as I know, he never piloted, he wasn't interested in that. That was transportation.
In 1965, he was driving around town in a VW Bug.
That was his favorite.
Favorite one. Until it got ran over down in the bottom down here.
All right up, ran over it.
We've got pictures of that too.
He wasn't in it.
No. He had just stepped out of it.
Yeah, and he got in the plane.
Yeah.
What happened to the car again?
He had a Volkswagen, the Bug, and the equipment that we build, the tires were literally, each one tire was wider than a Volkswagen. That's how huge the equipment was. This was a big scraper. It had 3 pans, so it was really long. Well, Mr. RG was at the plant, the factory up there, which is higher, the ground slopes from there down into Red Hill. He was up there, and one day he saw a piece of equipment off in the distance stopped. So he waited a few minutes, and he looked, and he was waiting, to see if it was going to move, and it didn't. So he's going to go fix it. Okay? All right, this is my opportunity. He gets in his Volkswagen, takes off down there, and the ground was so rough he just couldn't drive to it. So he went down and followed the tracks with the tread marks. He followed the track like running on a railroad track. He followed the tracks right up behind the car. Now you have to picture this piece of equipment was 75 yards long, one operator, and the operator was on the other end. So RG's coming from a distance, and behind him, pulls up behind the tire, and he gets out. From what I understand, he steps away from the car. The machine is curved, so the operator never saw the car, never saw him. The operator he cranks it up and it starts to move back. Well, RG sees it, and he turns, and he thought, no, I can't get in there. So he just stepped back, and literally, it was a pancake. And, of course, the operator knows he drove in there, and he felt this. There shouldn't have been anything behind him that would cause his machine to do that. So he stops. He gets out and walks back there, and there's RG standing there. In my car.
You put on his phone, give me a ride.
Now, I've heard several stories past that point. One that he got mad and wanted to fire the guy, and the foreman came down and said, no, it wasn't his fault. I've actually had 3 different people tell me they were driving the piece of equipment. There's only one man driving the piece of equipment.
Who was actually driving?
I don't know. I don't know.
Is one of the 3 called right up?
Oh, I don't know the names. I don't know.
No, he did run that equipment.
Oh, I know I did, yeah.
Yeah.
Al Holly was the superintendent.
Excuse me?
Al Holly, big Al Holly was the superintendent.
I don't think
Uh-huh.
he drove as much.
I've heard that name, but I don't think he was driving that day.
Another guy named Wally Watson drove it quite, he operated it quite a bit.
Really?
I remember when Wally was running.
Yeah. Well, there's several stories about that down there.
That scraper is what built I-20.
That's one of them. That's right. That's right. Mr. RG built the largest scraper ever built and ever will be built. It would haul 360 tons of earth. It has 3 pans. Hauled 360 tons of earth with one operator. And it was in the mid-60s where Interstate 20 had not been built. They were getting contracts for Interstate. Mr. RG got the contract to build, it's about 2.5 miles from Estes Parkway, where you cross the Interstate, from there all the way to the Sabine River, about 2.5, 3 miles. Now, if you've gone that way, it's just swamp, wet swamp, trees. Well, when you're on that stretch of property, as far as you can see both ways is LeTourneau property. When he came here in 46, he bought 10,000 acres. Okay? He bought the school here, but then at the front of the plant was the beginning from there to the back and all the way around towards Eastman. He bought 10,000 acres. Well, that included that swampy area along the Sabine River. They were building Interstate 20, they were getting contracts, so he bid on that 2.5 miles. And he got it. He got the contract. Now think about it. The other contractors were really upset about this because his bid was so low compared to theirs. But you think about it. He didn't have to transport any equipment anywhere. He built it right there and he just drove it down there. Okay? He owned the land, so that means he sold them the stretch of land where the road was going to go. Sell you this. Now you need to build it up. Well, I got some dirt right here. So he drove his scrapers down there, scraped it up where now there are ponds there. He scraped the dirt up, built it up, and so he sold them the property, he sold them the dirt, and he got paid for doing it. And he had no transportation costs. And the other contractors were really upset. And, you know, the people that were looking at the bids was like, this is legitimate. You know, they can't help it if he lived there, you know. So as far as I know, that 2.5 miles, he set a record of time building an interstate highway that probably still stands today, because unless you're going to match those conditions, you're not going to beat it. So, but that machine, the LT360, he only built one. He never sold one. After he built that, he used it for experimenting, and by the way, some of you may not know, we have our own steel mill behind the plant. Well, that's where it ended up. He just cut it up, made something else out of it. No scrap. The scrap didn't lay around over there very long because he just cut it up and make something else.
Did that get converted to a two-scraper?
At times, yes, a 240.
The two-scraper was used to build the memorial building.
Well, it wasn't that one. That wouldn't have been too big to go. He had others that were smaller that would have been brought over here. Yes, yes. Yeah, he had some out of the L90, which 330 yard pans, all sizes. But you could, any of those 3-pan scrapers, which were small to large, you could take 1 or 2 off. The operator was on one, the middle, so you could take the front and the back and still operate that one. So there was many, many combinations of those.
So what year did Mr. LeTourneau start speaking publicly, or he was starting?
He started when he got to Peoria, and that was in 35, so probably around 36. And what happened was the Chamber of Commerce in Peoria asked him to come speak. And he was, from what I understand, was shy. I mean, he wanted to build stuff, you know. But he said, okay, I'll go. And so he went, and from what I understand, he had a little speech prepared, and he got there, and he looked at all these people, and the light came on and said, this is a golden opportunity to share the gospel. And that's not why he went there, because it was like a Chamber of Commerce, a business meeting, you know. But so he just kind of threw his speech away and started winging it and shared the gospel with all of those guys and talked about the factory and everything. Caterpillar had moved there. He followed them in 35. And that was how he started speaking. People that were there then would ask him to come to their church or to this meeting. And that's kind of how it got started. And it just exploded from there. And then they started receiving letters. Will you come talk at my church? Or here or there, you know. And this was 35, 36. He didn't buy that first plane until 39. One of the reasons that he bought that plane that you're looking at right there is in 1937, he had it was a 36 Buick, big car, boat. It held 6 people. They had gone to a speaking engagement, and Mom went with him, so it was RG and Mom. RG was in the middle of the back seat. Mom was in the middle of the front seat. And he had a quartet of boys from the factory that he took to sing while he spoke. They'd gone to speak, and they were returning home, and they came around a curve, and an oncoming car was coming, and it was a little bit of a curve. The driver in the other car had turned around to talk to the passengers in the car. He didn't see what was happening, but his car was swerving over into their lane. Now we know these details because it happened in front of a house where a man was sitting on his porch, and he just saw it all happen. Their car swerved, and he's looking to the back. He knows nothing about this. And RG, the 2 boys on the right side, and Mom and the other boy beside RG were asleep. RG was awake. Of course, the driver was awake. The driver saw the oncoming, and it was kind of a built-up road, and he couldn't just take off to the side. He got as far over as he could, and instead of a solid 100% head-on, it was like headlight to headlight. It just smeared both cars. We have pictures of both cars. It killed all 3 occupants of the oncoming car. It killed the driver and the man sitting behind him, who was his brother. It killed 2 brothers. Mom, the other 2 boys were asleep, so they got banged up glass, cuts and bruises and that sort of thing. Mr. RG was awake, and he saw the whole thing coming. So he saw the car, and it was inevitable. He braced himself, and when he did that, and the impact drove both of his thigh bones up into his chest cavity. That's why I say people don't understand the tragedy. This has been part of their life. We only see, the good parts. But 5 people died that day. Took the others to the hospital, and the doctors assumed that Mr. RG was dying or dead at the hospital. He was laying there. They thought unconscious. The doctors were talking, and they were prioritizing the others, and they pointed over at RG and said, "This guy's too far gone. If we try to straighten him out, the trauma is going to kill him." RG heard him. He goes, "Listen," and he's on the bed. They think he's dead, The doctors are going, and he goes, "Listen, y'all get over here and take care of me. You straighten me out. You let me take care of the pain. Let's just do your job, okay?" And he said later, he knows they were doing their job. I mean, he wasn't upset, but he said, "Look, let's get on with it here. You let me take care of the pain." And of course, they straightened him out, and he made it through it. But then he went to flying. He said, this driving across country, these cars are a little dangerous. And then the first plane he gets, he crashes upside down, so can't get away from it.